Hi, my name's Shauna Gordon-McKeon. I'm coming at you. Well, actually, I'm usually from Washington, D.C. I'm at this very moment coming at you from West Virginia. I am a longtime open source developer. Oh, I think I have a slide for this. I'm a longtime open source developer, community manager, project manager, and most relevant for today, a governance consultant. I also like other things like teaching tech workers about their labor rights, and as previously mentioned, watching women's soccer. Got to throw that into every talk I give. So extremely brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I've learned a lot about governance over the last, let's say 10 years or so, and there's a lot of different things I could talk about, but I only have 20 minutes with you here today for this talk, so I wanted to keep things pretty high level. So I thought I will talk about the three sort of highest level frameworks that I use for thinking about governance, and those are process, culture, and relationship. So let's just dive right in. So the first thing I want to talk about is governance as a process. And this is what people typically think about when they think about governance, things like rules, regulations, procedures. How do things get decided? Is there going to be a vote? Is it going to be by consensus? I live in the United States, and if in the US you ask someone to describe our governance, they'd probably say something like, oh, well, there's like 3 branches of government, and the government has like checks and balances. Although side note, if you're thinking, if someone asked me about US governance, I would not talk about checks and balances. I would say, oh, it's so dysfunctional, it's so polarized, it's so corrupt. And that is very fair. So like A, correct. And B, that's more of a governance as culture lens. And we will definitely get to that. But for a lot of folks, they will give you that 3 branches of government checks and balances explanation. So that's totally fair. That's a very important lens. So we're going to start with it right off. So there's actually a lot of different processes when it comes to governance. And what I'm calling classic governance is probably the one that people are thinking about. So that's like 3 branches of governance, checks and balances. How do people decide things? What are the rules for deciding things? I actually have an example from the Python ecosystem. So for over 20 years, the Python programming language was run by Guido van Rossum, who was a sort of BDFL, our benevolent dictator for life. And then in 2017, he stepped down. And he could have said, well, so-and-so is in charge now. But instead, he sort of said, well, you guys figure it out. I trust you. You guys figure it out. And so the team of core developers had to figure out a bunch of different things at once. They had to figure out not just who was going to replace Guido, but also like what was going to replace Guido. Is it going to be another BDFL? Is it going to be a different model? And there was actually even another question they had to figure out, which was, how are they going to decide all of this? Like previously, Guido had just been in charge because Guido was in charge from the very beginning. There was no model for like how you make a decision about what the classic governance is going to be. And I actually have, the slide is missing. Oh, there it is. Oh, that must have been, I copied and pasted the slide from a talk I gave at PyCon in 2019, I think. And I must have somehow brought only one of the slide animations over with me. But in any case, so this slide is literally copied and pasted from that talk. It's in this particular slide, it's comparing the PyCon governance transition of 2017 to the United States governance transition of 1787, and the sort of talking about the different levels of governance that these very fundamental classic governance transitions happen at. So if this intrigues you, I have a link to the talk at the end of the slides to learn more about it. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think in some ways it's a little over-focused on. I mean, I think all governance is a little under-focused on, but of the types of governance, I feel like the process and the classic governance process is the thing that is talked about the most. But there are many different approaches, and so I want to make sure other things get their fair time. So in addition to this sort of classic governance process, there's other governance processes in projects. So for instance, codes of conduct are a set of rules or guidelines for how people need to behave, as well as processes and procedures for reporting and addressing potential violations. So that's a governance process. Technical decision-making documents. For example, in Python, I use Python for a lot of my examples. That's where I spent the most time. So in Python, back in 2001, so over 20 years ago, they adopted something called PEPs, or Python Enhancement Proposals, which is a procedure for making technical decisions. And a lot of projects have copied this. So there's the Kubernetes Enhancement Proposals, or KEPs, the Jupyter Enhancement Proposal, or JEPs. And there's other proposals that are like this that are not modeled and named after the Python version. But so these is another type of governance process. Things like sprint planning, roadmaps, and pull request review. Again, these are procedures and processes that are adopted in order to help make decisions. So even though they don't necessarily seem like governance, they are, in a sense, governance. And sometimes projects will not explicitly spell out this step, but that doesn't make it not governance. It just means it's undocumented governance. And then one last thing, there's many more than this, but just another one I wanted to call out, because again, I think this kind of gets overlooked as a governance process, but I think it's actually really important. And it demonstrates the value of using a governance lens to look at it. So newcomer onboarding, how do people join a project? Is there an onboarding guide? Is there a mentorship program? Again, we don't typically see these questions as governance questions, but I, in fact, know of multiple maintainers or BDFLs of projects that actually really wish that they could hand over their decision-making power to a more democratic group of people, but they don't have community members to hand it to. And so in order to get that, they need good newcomer onboarding, they need mentorship programs, they need like a leadership pipeline. So even though those aren't really usually used, seen through a governance lens, you can see how they are in fact governance questions. And if you ignore them, it's like ignoring a dependency. It causes your project to break, it causes your governance to break because you weren't considering it. Unfortunately, so just as an open source project is more than its code, governance is more than the specific processes and procedures. And unfortunately, people tend to over rely on the process element, maybe because it's easier to see and reason about and control. So like, there's no way to objectively know that your culture is good, but you could objectively say, hey, we've followed the steps of this process. Like, this is our process and we have followed these steps. So it's easier to control, easier to reason about. But over-reliance on processes can be bad for projects. Process has drawbacks. It requires time and energy. It slows things down. And it's not always worth having. There's plenty of times where having a specific process is just like not actually the right move for a situation. And some people dislike governance as a whole because they associate it with the specific failure mode, which is a project with a ton of process and that is over-relying on process and getting stuck in process. So what are some other lenses that can kind of help us get out of this failure mode? So another lens I like to think about is governance as a relationship. And I have a metaphor here about how a process is an abstraction and then relationships are like an instantiation, but I think for time, I'm going to skip it. But if anyone's really curious, you can ask in the Q&A or message me after, because it is a good metaphor. So I'm just gonna skip that. Okay, so you might have a code of conduct that says X behavior isn't okay, and if you see X behavior, you're gonna report it to Y person, and they're gonna do Z thing to address it. And that's a process. That's an abstraction about how things should work, hypothetically. But in the real world, a behavior always has a context. So the people that enact and receive a behavior that might violate the code of conduct, they have relationships to each other, and the people enforcing the code of conduct have relationships to each other. There might be a conflict of interest, or they just like, that's just one kind of relationship that might have an impact. Or again, to reference that example I just gave, you know, if someone's a BDFL and they want to hand over power to a more democratic process, they have to have people that they can actually trust. If the people that happen to be there happen to be people that they're like, I don't know about them, they're probably not going to want to participate in a governance transition. So if you only use a process lens, you don't see the absolutely vital importance of specific relationships in a specific project. Oh, that's not, wrong slide. So I can't speak as well to the global open source community, but I think especially here in the US where I'm based, there's often a tendency to discount the relationship and relational and focus on the technical. And I think it's partially because of the US culture of individualism, which can easily become isolating and toxic. I think there's also there's an element of sexism here, where focusing on the relational elements are seen as like associated with women and thus devalued and seen as unimportant. I think also for some people, thinking about relationships is scary, especially if you've experienced any kind of relational trauma, which an absolutely huge number of people have, even if they don't realize it. But I think this relational lens is absolutely crucial. And there's tons of relationships in an open source project. This is just a sketch of some at an extremely high level. You have maintainers to new contributors, maintainers to existing long-term contributors, the relationship of the whole contribution community to users, the relationship to funders, and then all of these people to each other. And again, this is extremely high level. Like within any of these groups, you also have different relationships. So for example, within the group of contributors, you might have some people who are making code contributions and people are making non-code contributions. And the people who are making non-code contributions might feel devalued or like less than the people who are making code contributions. And that might change how they interact with the project and what they do in the project. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what makes a relationship good and how we can apply this to governance of open source projects. So these are things that generally make a relationship good. This is not specific to open source, it's not specific to program. This is just like a general statement. So in good relationships, people are able to state their needs just for the sake of stating needs, not without an expectation that by stating their needs, they will get something, but just for the purpose of making sure everyone has information about what they need. Ability to state harm. So if something happens that hurts them, again, an ability not in order to achieve a specific outcome in terms of justice, which is not saying you can't want a specific outcome or want a specific thing, but just the ability to state what has happened and share your perspective. The ability to grow together in a relationship, because people are constantly changing, and sometimes in relationships, if you get too stuck in your idea of who the other person is, it can cause them to not want to grow because they don't want to damage the relationship. So a healthy, good relationship allows people to grow together. The ability to bring your whole self into the relationship, not to feel like you have to hide parts of yourself. And the ability to have fun together. A sense of shared meaning and purpose can be like absolutely like one of they've done studies where they look at people who are like they're firefighters together or like they're working on like something deeply meaningful, and that's one of the most bonding things you can have is to be working on something meaningful with someone. And then commitment and the ability to rely on each other. And you can have a good relationship without any one specific one of these things, but there are things that tend to be associated with good relationships. And good processes support good relationships, and good relationships help processes flow smoothly. And they also help us get through the moments where the process is broken and needs to be fixed. And like, there's nothing in our list of rules and procedures for how to deal with the situation. If we have good relationships, we can deal with those moments because we don't need the process to survive. We have our relationships to each other. The last ones I want to talk about is governance as culture. And culture is in some sense the relationship of the group to the people in the group, a relationship at like a group level instead of an individual level. And a good culture supports good relationships and good processes and is supported by them. So they're all overlapping and supporting each other. When we intentionally cultivate a specific kind of culture, we're nurturing certain kinds of relationships and we're making certain kinds of processes more effective and vice versa. So there's different types of culture that you can support. And I think there's some things where you're like, oh, who wouldn't want a welcoming culture? Who wouldn't want like a big, like vibrant, diverse culture? And I mean, I think overall there are some things that tend to be better than others, but like there are many different kinds of good flourishing cultures out there. So thinking intentionally about what are your values, what are your goals for the project as a community, and how can your culture support that is really important. So what makes a culture good? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, the same things that make relationships good are important parts of good culture. So the ability to state needs without entitlement can be reframed as a culture that is explicit about the goals, boundaries, limitations of the community so that people can opt in and say, hey, this is a good culture for me, in the same way that someone, if you're going on a date or you're talking to a potential new friend, and you're sharing a bit about yourself, you might be like, oh, actually, you know what? I'm not going to like, throw my coffee at this other person and leave. But like, when this is over, I'm probably not going to hang out with them again because like, I don't think this is the right vibe for me. Similarly, with a culture, you want to be explicit about how your culture works and what your needs are as a community so that people can sort of be like, oh yeah, this is for me, or that they can opt out. The ability to state harm without blame. People should feel comfortable talking about things that are bothering them in the community. If they're feeling left out, if they're feeling excluded, if the community is changing and they don't want to go in that direction, they should feel comfortable saying so. it doesn't necessarily mean that the critiques they have will be enacted, but they should feel comfortable talking about that. Again, the ability to grow together. Cultures and communities, just like individual people and individual relationships, grow and change, and that's an amazing thing. And a good culture will not get stuck in one vision of itself, but will be able to change and evolve over time. The ability to be your whole self. This is a really important one. So I'm going to take a second to focus on it. So I think this covers a lot of different things, including ability to like talk about your personal backgrounds, like the demographics you have, to not feel like that is unwelcome. I also think to focus on an element of that I've referenced before about like over focus on code. So another element is like an ability to bring in all of your diverse skill sets and your diverse interests. An over-focus on codes means that a lot of open source projects don't actually get the help they need with non-code things. And this is like a constant problem in open source projects. It's one of the biggest challenges in open source projects. So things that I have seen projects really desperately need help with include design, user experience research, project management. Community management is a huge one. People often feel like only a single skill or a single part of them, the part that is interested in coding and knows how to code, is valued. And so they're not bringing the other parts of themselves. And people who have other skills are not even identifying that they might have fun and find meaning within an open source project. And then also, having a diversity of perspective and experiences makes it easier to spot potential problems in a project. So a culture that embraces diversity, for example, if there's people in the project that have accessibility needs or have have relationships with people with accessibility needs, are more likely to spot when there's a potential accessibility problem in a project than people who haven't. So a project that embraces the whole self, the diversity of the individual, the diversity of the community, is more likely to be proactive about noticing and solving different problems. The ability to have fun together is just as important in a community and a culture as it is an individual relationship. Life is short. Let's enjoy ourselves. Again, sense of shared meaning and purpose. Like open source projects often have like a really beautiful shared meaning and purpose, and like focusing on that and emphasizing that and seeing the different ways that we are fulfilling that meaning and purpose by participating in projects together is a beautiful thing. And then commitment and the ability to rely on each other. I also want to talk for a second longer about this because it has some interesting open source specific effects. So a lot of open source is volunteer driven. And it can be tempting to say, well, okay, well, they're volunteers, they're giving their time, like they should be allowed to ghost us if they need to. But there are actually a lot of different volunteer projects out there that require commitment. So for example, many years ago, I used to volunteer on a crisis hotline, and it took 3 weeks to train us because it was really important that we be trained well. And in exchange for doing the training, which there was a waiting list for, you committed to serving a certain number of shifts for at least a year. So you're making a significant commitment in exchange for like how much work was going into training you. And I did it gladly. Everyone who I was with did it gladly. Sometimes there were some folks who didn't actually fulfill the terms that they were given, but that was because they just found the work too overwhelming. And no one was like judging or mad at them for it, but no one was flaking out just because they found something better to do. Your project's community members should be getting enough out of the participation in terms of having fun, growing, getting a sense of shared meaning, that they're willing and eager to make commitments to you. And again, with the caveat that like this doesn't mean that like folks make a commitment and then if they break the commitment, they're dead to you. Like there should be like a process of like repair, etc. But it's not impossible or a bad thing to have commitment in volunteer-driven projects. And that commitment and sense of reliability can be really important for the success of a project because people want to be able to rely on each other. Okay, so these are the 3 lenses. I think I actually have not been following the time, but I think that's about 20 minutes. Hopefully I'm not too far over or under. But yeah, so these are the 3 lenses that I use. And I think an overfocus on any one of these to the exclusion of the others can be really bad for a project. And I do think we have an unfortunate tendency to over-focus on the process, or sometimes we're just not thinking about governance at all, which is also not great. I have a ton more that I could share with you, but we are at the end of time. But here are some links to some other resources. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to list them all out. You can go through the slides and click through them. All of the green ones are a link. I have a newsletter. You can follow me on Mastodon. Image credits for the images. And then there's a link to the slides themselves if anyone wants to take a look at the slides, which will make it easier to click through those links if you actually have access to the slides. And I can post that in the Zoom chat. But yeah, that's thank you so much. Excited to answer questions for the next few minutes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was just saying, please continue.
Like, I was wondering about governance as a whole, because like you explained all the three lenses, but like there must be a lot of situations where a crossover or like a conflict happens between probably process and relationship, or sometimes culture and process, and like solving conflicts there, because like we might have to be flexible with the structure sometimes to like maintain our relationships for contributor retention and for project resilience. So like I would want to know more about how somebody would like approach resolving conflicts out of three lenses when something like happens between the community.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of the reason why I used the word lenses is that it's sort of three ways of seeing. And especially when you're in any sort of conflict, being able to see with all three lenses at once, or like sequentially, you can be like, how can I think about this from a process perspective? How can I think about this from a relationship perspective? How can I see this from a culture perspective? So like, if there's a conflict in the community, it's important to be able to look at your processes and see, is this in violation of our process? Are we missing a process that would help make this smoother? But you don't want to over-focus on that. Like another element is like, who is this person? Like, have they been, like a conflict with someone who's brand new to the community is going to be very, very different from a conflict with like the lead maintainer of a project. Just like vast differences. And then, you know, you might have two people who have the same relationship to project. Maybe they've both been around for a few years. They're a frequent contributor, but they're not like a lead maintainer. But also things like, you know, has there been trouble before? Does this seem like a values mismatch? Are they going through something right now? Like, do they not get along with one specific person, and maybe it's up for someone else to sort of talk through with them? And then also from a culture perspective, like how we resolve this conflict? What kind of implications does it have for our culture and our values and how we want other people to view the project? Like, do we want people to be like, this is a project where a given conflict, like, I think one thing, and I didn't talk about this at all, but it's something I care about a lot and could easily have given another half an hour talk on. But a lot of times folks think that like a good culture is a culture with no conflict, and like a psychologically safe culture is a culture with no conflict. But I don't think that's true. I think a psychologically safe, healthy culture is one in which conflict happens and it's a regular thing and people respect each other. And so people can see, oh, I can raise problems, I can talk about conflicting needs, and I'm not going to be kicked out of the community. I'm going to continue to have these relationships that matters to me, this shared purpose, a sense of fun that matters to me. I think the healthiest communities are one in which conflict is happening all the time, and people are not even noticing it as conflict because they associate conflict with like pain and suffering and like anger, but like the conflict is just being resolved at a level before people are really angry about it. So yeah, but different cultures will have different like approaches to anger. Like maybe it's a bit more private and like conflicts are resolved like quietly versus publicly, and like there's different cultural decisions you can make. So I think all three lenses are important. I think when you get to the point of conflict, I think that relational lens is so important. And it's like, it's a struggle for open source projects, but it's also a legacy of our culture as a whole that doesn't really talk about or teach us tools for conflict resolution, relationship building, etc. So I think it's really important, but also something that a lot of folks struggle with. Should I call on someone? Looks like Rupa has their hand up.
Yeah, I didn't know if I should just unmute myself and ask. I apologize that I don't have my camera on right now. So thank you so much for this really insightful kind of overview on these lenses through which you look at governance. It's super helpful in thinking about kind of my own processes and the way that I'm thinking about these things in my communities and the communities that I'm working with. I think you were talking in the last response about values mismatch and thinking about where people kind of are not on the same page as what values they espoused or kind of where conflict emerges in these relationships. My project for the fellowship really deals with values alignment. It's really like that's kind of the core of what I'm working with. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about, through your own experiences or experiences that you've seen about how to get people to articulate what those values are and also to get people on the same page, even if their values are not in alignment, even if they are mismatched. How do you get folks to really kind of lay out what they see as the purposes, as the goals of a community, whether that's through the processes they adopt or the culture that they are, and kind of lay everything on the table so that it can at least be articulated so that the process of kind of resolution and compromise can actually start happening? And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think in terms of laying values out, there's sort of two questions, which is how do you do it at all? And then how do you do it when there's like a conflict of values? So in terms of how do I do it at all, one exercise, and this gets at like the idea that process can be helpful for culture and vice versa. One process that I've done a number of times and found really effective is to do just a collaborative community creation of a value statement. And this actually came, so I didn't include this in the talk because I didn't have time, but like how I first got involved in governance was I got asked sort of last minute to facilitate a governance transition for a project called Open Data Kit. And they were like, hey, we're going to have like 60 people from around the world being flown into Seattle for a 3-day long conference, which we have at that conference. And like, can you facilitate it? And I was like, yes, I've never done this before, but yes, it sounds fascinating. On the first day, we were kind of going around and around in circles a little bit. And I sort of spontaneously decided that I wanted folks to sort of get that sense of shared meaning and purpose together, and that we were kind of getting too far down into the nitty-gritty. And I was like, what is like the highest level of what brings these peoples together? Their values. So it's like, why don't we do an exercise where we have like a community mission statement / value statement? And so I was at the front of a room and I was like, I'm just going to start typing, and people just raise their hand and say what your values are. And then if people just agree, like do like the fingers or the clapping. And then if you want to add to it, just like raise your hand and you can add to it. You can like add in new values. And so I just like started writing, and it was just like this mishmash of a document with people plus wanting things here and there. And actually there was like very little disagreement on the values. It was just like different people emphasized different ones. And then afterwards, after the exercise, I sort of cleaned it up and made it clearer. And then I was like, how do folks think about this? And there were a few more like nitpicks, and then did it again. And then we had a value statement, a mission statement. And that was, I think, a really big culture change for that project, because everyone was like, well, we all agree on these like core values. That's actually like, it really gives people strength to work through details of conflict if you're like, but we're aligned on the big things. In terms of when there's conflict on the big things, I actually think one of the tricky things about values is that there's actually at heart very little disagreement about values. I think I would be willing to put money, maybe not a ton of money, on in this room, and there's a lot of us with, I think, pretty diverse backgrounds. I believe we actually all share basically all the same values. I think what's often causing conflict is that people value different values in different amounts. But I think people want belonging, they want purpose, they want togetherness, they want safety, they want opportunity, they want reliability. Like, people all agree on these things, but they disagree about how you get there, and also when the things are in tension, which should be valued more. So often coming down to values allows people, even in pretty extreme disagreement about the specifics, to be like, okay, actually, we are still both human. We do still share some core values. I do think there are some like additional things that happen. So for example, one thing that comes up a lot in open source projects is I think there's a sense that all projects should be welcoming to newcomers. Because all of us, including the people who secretly don't want their project to be welcoming to newcomers, value the idea that newcomers should have a place that they can go to learn and be welcomed to the community. They want newcomers in their community as a whole. But it might be that for a specific project, what they really value is being able to work really quickly. Or maybe they're really enjoying having like a small group of people like working on like, I don't know if any of you all have ever worked on a small team that's just like really well connected, and like sometimes you don't want to like have like a big vast community. You like working with your 5 buddies. There's nothing wrong with that desire. But because if you've internalized this feeling that you have to live up to all of your values at all of the time, you're going to experience conflict when inevitably you're like, oh, sometimes I have to optimize for certain values over others. So I think sometimes something that can happen with open source projects is that people who don't have the capacity or the interest for a specific project in being welcoming to newcomers feel like they should be welcoming to newcomers. So they try to go through a few of like the motions, but then they're like, man, this sucks. It's like a really unpleasant experience. It's like, yeah, you're doing what you think you should be doing instead of what you want to be doing. So I think that can also be a problem where people are like, unwilling to see that they have multiple values in conflict because they don't want to think of themselves. And also because culturally, we haven't done a good enough job of saying like, not every project needs to have the exact same culture and be the exact right fit for everybody. Like cultures can be specific and distinct and not a good fit for everyone. And I think an approach of like getting folks to like, if you get them to the point where they're willing to talk about values at all, be like, let's list all of our values and have someone else point out the conflict that maybe they're not willing to see internally and say like, hey, you said that you want to be welcoming to newcomers, but you said you also really value like having these like this like small, experience of like a small group working hard, going really fast together and not having to stop and explain things. That's valid too, which is actually more important to you here. It's okay if it's this other one that's like maybe slightly less culturally acceptable. I do think like sometimes you'll be in a situation where people don't want to talk about values, or people don't want to talk about relationships. And I think that gets back to sort of like cultural biases that say talking about these things is like, I don't know, too feminine and girly or too weak or whatever. And that's like toxic, masculine, hyper-capitalist, individualist culture for you. And I don't have any great solutions to that. I would love it if I was like, here's how we fix all of the big problems with society. So if you've got someone who's sort of like, I don't want to talk about this at all, that's a lot harder. But if you have people who are willing to talk about it, but just feel kind of stuck, I think the approach of let's list out everything and then let's look at how there are maybe some conflicts within, just like you would do with a group as a whole, you can do with an individual person and be like, look, we all have lots of values. We all have lots of needs. Sometimes there are conflicts. And the only way we can resolve those conflicts is to actually see them and talk about them. If you don't see them and talk about them, you can't resolve them.
Thank you so much. That's actually hugely validating for the way that I'm approaching my project. So I really appreciate that.
Maybe we'll have just a couple more questions. I know we're kind of at our Q&A time, but I just want to give a couple more opportunities if folks have questions, if that's okay. Great.
I have a question. You mentioned that you do some work kind of consulting with open source projects on sustainability. I'm curious what tools you found effective to help teams, like leadership teams in open source projects, consider labor and consider like the economic resources at hand. And yeah.
I mean, that's a really big question. So I'll start off by saying that I have my own personal quirks and hesitations around talking a lot about money. So this is a topic that I am less comfortable with. Like I've really been trying to lean into it and grow in this area, but I feel like I can speak with a little less experience and expertise than around some other topics. Although I think that's also, in some cases, like the thing that you are you struggle the most with ends up being a thing that you can help the most with, I'm like excited to get better at this and then be able to address people as being like, hey, do you also not like to talk about money? Here's how you can talk about money, even though you really don't want to. But yeah, so that's like one big challenge, is that like a lot of folks don't like talking about money. Some folks extrapolate on that to be like, well, because I don't like talking about money and because I don't like the impact of money in society, no one should ever get paid for their work, which obviously I do not agree with. I think there's a couple of different questions here. One is around like, for an open source project, like how do you grow your financial resources? Another is how do you distribute the financial resources you have? There's also questions around like, I think in terms of growing financial resources, I think that one model that I'm very interested in, I've seen it work successfully in a couple cases, but I want to explore it a lot more, is the idea of like a product development committee. One of the issues in open source is that because there's not like that reliability component, and it's hard, like if a project hasn't determined how you're gonna, like how you decide how to work on things, and it's really volunteer driven, who's gonna work on this, who's gonna work on that, etc., then someone who might actually be willing to give money to the project in exchange for certain things to be done has no way of really, they don't even conceive of the project as a place where they can go to get those things done. So for projects that are big enough, I've seen some projects make a leap where they're like, okay, we're gonna have a product development committee. If you donate this much amount of money to the project, you can have a seat on the product development committee. The committee will like make decisions via consensus or by vote about what things are done. On a more informal level, you might have a project that's crowdfunded, and then you've got maybe not enough money to like pay anyone to work full time, that you could then be like, please work on this, this, and this thing. But you might have like a pot of a few $1,000s or something that you've gotten from crowdfunding, and you want to decide what should this be used for. And I think the rule of thumb of like, I guess I would have two rules of thumbs around distributing money. One is like, what is the stuff that no one wants to do? That's the thing you should pay for. And then another rule of thumb being like, what is the force multiplier? What is the thing that is going to enable other work to be done, other like resources to come in? And so I think that like there's a tendency for people to be like, oh, we've got some money into the project, let's pay it for someone to build this feature, which is almost never the right. It can be the right choice, but it is often not the right choice because someone wants to build that feature anyway. And also the feature is not that important in the broad scheme of things. I think often what you want to do with that money is hire a community manager or someone who can, even like a fundraiser. I mean, there's not a ton of people in this space who have the skill set, but someone who can be like, okay, you have a little bit of money. You want someone who can help grow the community in a direction where you're more sustainable. That's going to be a more effective use of the money because it's going to enable like a virtuous cycle of continued growth, continued sustainability, and resilience. But yeah, I think this is like such a thorny problem because there's process questions, there's culture questions, there's relational questions, in terms of both like we don't have structures and role models really to work with very well. I mean, folks are working on, people are doing this successfully, but there's not like best practices yet. But then also like yeah, someone saying that there's like cultural differences in how folks talk about money. Someone said that in the chat, like I agree. So it can just be a very thorny topic. So great question. Yeah, also there can just be like legal, like the legal, if you're, because these projects often just like start from nothing, like a couple of, like one person just starting, throwing some code up on GitHub and then like flash to a few years later and it's a big group of people. But like, so I guess another element there is on the legal side, something I see happen a ton is finding fiscal sponsorship, and Open Collective, the organization Open Collective, as well as I think TideLift does this as well, enables you to, with relatively low overhead and relatively low process, like join a organization that can handle the legal and like tax side of things for you. Or you could join a foundation in the Python ecosystem. There's like NumFocus, Software Freedom Conservancy, and there's a lot of different foundations out there, and those will usually have a bit higher, take a higher percentage of money coming in, and have like more boutique services. But also just on like, because that is certainly an area I do not know much about and have much specialty in. So if you're dealing with any significant amount of money, you want to go through an org that will keep you legally compliant.
Do you have any more questions? Hi, Raphael. I missed the very first 5 minutes. But I joined in silently, sorry. Yeah, I do have a question if we still have a minute to give. What do you think?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any opinions or experience seeing organizations dealing with governance, not just for their core project, but also relationships with third-party projects that depend on the project or are like reinterpretations of the same API or something similar. Because I found that to be a little bit challenging to navigate, and even the boundary is not always entirely clear what is first party or third party.
Yeah, this is actually something I know a lot about, and I think is a super common pattern in the open source space. So I've been consulting for like 15 years at this point, but I did take a break from consulting to just try out what a full-time job was like. So I worked as a developer relations specialist for edX in 2015, 2016-ish. And they had the exact model you're talking about, where there's an open source project. And so that was primarily used by edX, the platform website. But then it was open source. So there was a number of other organizations around the world that were using the open edX platform. And I've seen this happen with a number of other clients, including like some current clients I have. And often this sets up this, like, I think by default, there's a dynamic where the resources for funding the project initially are coming from whatever organization started the project. And so there's like a default, basically internal development process, which might be kind of informal, where like the needs of the specific founding organization are prioritized by default. And so often you'll basically have people starting to use the project and there's just like no formal process. There might not even be relationships yet, depending on if the people who are sort of like the external users, the external developers, depending on how much effort they're putting into getting to know the people. So you might have people who are like showing up on a GitHub or like being like, hey, let's do a Zoom call, or I'm even in your town, let me stop by and like I develop on this project. So like one of the big challenges is identifying who your third-party people, your downstream people even are, developing relationships with them. Like a big element of what I did as a developer relations person was just have like regular meetings with folks so they could articulate the problems they were having. And then as that happens, you can start to build processes. And I think this is an area where processes are pretty helpful. Often because people who are outside, they don't always feel like part of the culture. They don't necessarily feel like they have strong relationships. So processes, if you're committing to a process, that can often help build trust. And then as part of the process, you're interacting with them. So then you're building the relation, you're building the shared culture. So for instance, when I was working at edX, the internal developers, if they wanted to add a feature, they would use this internal process that was completely opaque and different from what the open source people were doing. But sometimes they wanted to do something that needed to go through a project management review instead of just being like, here's a feature, merge it. And there were issues where people would spend a lot of time on a feature that they wanted to submit upstream, and the project management team would be like, no, like this is missing all these things that we would have caught on review. So a big thing I did was just talk to the project management team and be like, look, can we adapt this so that external people can go through project management, like product review, before they do all the work of implementing a new feature. So I think processes can help. There's also questions around, and it depends on the project, like whether it's, I have a fork of your project and I'm trying to maintain this fork indefinitely. I have a plugin and this is like a plugin ecosystem. The details of what the process is are going to differ depending on what kind of review is needed, what kind of interaction and feedback and information is needed. But I do think that for bringing in people who are sort of external and peripheral to the community, process is really helpful. But then also like the core group is going to have all of these opportunities to talk to each other, especially if it's they're all employed and they're like doing sprints and stand-ups, and like the company will often be like, hey, like we're literally just having social hours because we understand that our employees should be friendly with each other. And so third-party people are going to be excluded from that. And it is very, very easy for that to really cause them to drift away, feel like their concerns are not being heard. So also doing social things, like if you can do nothing else as a project, just being like, hey, once a month we meet up on Zoom and hang out. Like, very low effort. You do have to be able to commit to doing something every month. But like, if you're doing absolutely nothing else for your project, just do that, because that allows you to start building those relationships and then invite those third-party people, invite folks who have no other way of really building relationships with you to that. So yeah, relationship building, and then I think process can be very, very effective for third-party relationships.
Thanks, Shauna.
So I think we'll close on that question if that's okay. And thank you so much for, I mean, can we give like an air round of applause a little for those who are on camera? Yay!
One more thing, actually, which is just folks should feel free to reach out to me after this if you have any more questions. I also, as part of my governance consulting work, I give an hour free consultation to anyone who signs up for it. So if you have a specific project or specific question you're working on, if you go to you can either email me directly, or if you go to the governingopen.com website that's on the slide, you can find a link there to sign up. But yeah, happy to keep talking to folks. Just reach out.
And yes, and as somebody who was in a session with you that you graciously gave to many of us in our community, highly recommend taking up that offer. Yes, thank you all. Thank you so much. And we can also send that out in another email, be like, just to remind people to poke you. I hope you get many, I was going to say pokes, but maybe just like emails is better. It's a strange way of saying that. So let's start with taking our 5-minute break and circle back, get some water, get ready to engage in more conversation. And I think you might be leaving us now, Shauna, so we'll be saying goodbye. Thank you so much.
So just super quick, for those who don't know me, I'm David Hecht. I'm one of the processing fellows working with Dorothy on a project around open source conflict resolution practices and making a system around that. Dorothy's actually going to be doing the main thing here, presenting about labor and governance, open source maintenance, labor and governance. I'm just going to introduce, we wanted to do a quick kind of tone setting activity, like a grounding, but it'll be a shared prompt and response. And I think we'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to do this. So you should see my screen, which is the shared notes doc, which everyone should have access to. So in the spirit and flavor of this town hall on governance, we wanted to get everyone in sort of the same headspace around their own approaches to this. And so we thought of a question that we'd love for you all to just give a quick couple words or sentence response to. And that question is, what is a value you look for in an organization that puts you in a space of trusting the organization or the people in it? And so, yeah, let's take like a minute or two just to jot down any thoughts you have or reflections on that, especially given what Shauna's wonderful presentation did, and then we'll jump into Dorothy's talk. It looks like we're finishing up. That's an amazing list. And feel free to keep adding to it. And we're not going to go through it right now in the interest of time. But I think if you give a quick look over, I see a lot of common themes, kind of as Shauna was implying. There's a lot of alignment in people doing this kind of work, I think. Maybe later we'll do what Shauna said and clean up this list and see how much overlap and relation there is. So this is something we can take away. But Thank you all for doing that and sharing. And now I'll pass it over to Dorothy. Let me stop my sharing.
Thank you. I'm just gonna do my screen share here. And the plan is for me to present for the next 10 minutes. And following that, we will then have a more of a breakout room discussion. And we have some prompts prepared for each room. So we'll have a more of an opportunity for everyone to share in a small group setting. And the title of my presentation is Labor, Scale, and Open Source Governance. And I'm Dorothy. I'm a social science researcher, open technology advocate, Wikipedian. I have some experience with Blender, Python. I'm a consultant for open source sustainability, and I also do project archiving. And I am a lifelong learner with many different fields I'm interested in. There's a long list here. I really care about feminist approaches to research methodology, and I'm really interested in using social science methodology to study computing. And I'm also really interested in applying research knowledge directly to improve community work and to do research with communities about topics that are important to communities. And I got interested in open source through Wikipedia. So my open source journey started in 2013. And ever since, I've done many different things in Wikipedia and in other open source projects. I became fascinated with Wikipedia as an example of a functioning international open knowledge project, and started learning about the many active registered editors. If you didn't know, there's about 100,000 active registered editors in English. Wikipedia alone, it's a huge, huge community, and I've had a chance to contribute in a lot of different capacities. And as a Wikipedia editor, I have gone through different cycles of participation. And at some point, I was working so much as a volunteer Wikipedia organizer and editor, I burned out and I just left the community. And I left pretty quickly. I wouldn't say I burned bridges, but I was so exhausted. And then I started thinking and realizing that many people burn out of open source projects. And I started listening to stories of people who had loved open source projects. It was a big part of their life, and then they burned out and they left. And so I started thinking about burnout as a way to talk about labor and to look at what wasn't working in organizations. And so I've been now presenting my work in a number of places that do open source sustainability, and trying to figure out how to provide insights about open source labor to people that are trying to build open source sustainability, because there's all sorts of money that's now coming into open source from the corporate world who relies upon open source. And so labor is becoming an interesting area to work. And I keep asking, who is paying the costs of open source? And so in talking about burnout, what am I talking about? Well, my research has led me to explore different ways that people drop out, break, or transition in open source. Some instances might be shifting energy to another project. People who just become unresponsive start ghosting. People who their work ends or changes because they switch jobs. Often burnout will be a response to a toxic community or feelings of alienation. So my research has made me think a lot about the emotional landscape of labor in the open source world. Through Wikipedia, I've been exploring how Wikipedia is related to making things like AI good at answering obscure questions. So anyway, I want to talk about governance by talking about labor and burnout. And what issues do maintainers face as projects grow and scale? This has been a research question that I've explored, and just going to start with the insights and then kind of backtrack and talk more about the research itself. So some of the insights from conducting research on labor in open source, I've written about how as projects scale, the nature of labor, the labor project maintainers do fundamentally changes. And open source maintainers can be proactive about equitable labor practices by considering labor as a factor of scale. And another concept is that institutions should consider governance labor when making demands from open source projects. So what do I mean when I say maintainer? Well, when we talk about governance and maintaining governance and maintaining open source projects, it might mean many things. But I'm bringing this up because in order to do research on open source maintenance, we had to consider how to define maintenance. And then I came to realize that, it means many things for many people. Another thing with scale is it's not a really definitive term either. It gets thrown around a lot in a corporate context, talking about at scale or scalable. So there's not necessarily one thing that we mean by scale or being large scale, but there is some notion in open source projects, often a notion that success is related to growth. So some different dimensions of scale to consider are the number of users, the number of contributors, the kind of users, the size, complexity, and features of a code base, the system resources on the back end, and interdependence in a software ecosystem. So there are many different ways to define what scale even is. I'm just going to go through a couple different stories that relate to how labor changes as projects scale. So the first story is about something called a benevolent dictator for life. And this term, benevolent dictator, has been used a lot in software projects because often projects will start out being authored by one person or maybe a couple people who then have a huge say in the future of the code and a huge say in the future of the open source project. But many different open source projects, including the processing P5JS, started as just a couple people and then grew to a massive international organization, and had to experience growing pains along the way about the transition of power from a few individuals to a community, and figuring out along the way how do we move from just a couple people to having contributors and participants define what the governance should be and what the values should be. Another example of scalar labor comes up with the dependence of large or elite institutions on software projects. If Google, for instance, started integrating your code into one of their products, all of a sudden you might experience a lot of demands coming from the corporate world. I have spoken to many open source maintainers who have faced issues around elite institutions adopting their software and making lots of demands, and then governance having to adopt or adapt. So this can be another place where growing pains emerge when open source projects scale in different directions. And I'm almost out of time here, but I'm going to continue just a little bit longer. And the other element of scalar labor is when developers become hypervisible leaders and promoters. So something that I have been examining is when a core maintainer of software then becomes someone who is kind of taken away from what they started doing and become a sort of talking head or speaker of the open source project, and what that means in terms of their own burnout. Having spoken to many open source maintainers, issue that keeps coming up is people saying, I didn't sign up for this. And there's when projects become bigger and the people who design the projects have to then present about them and try to and have some idea of getting more people to use the thing, they may be taken away from what they originally started doing or wanted to do, and that can be another place of growing pains. So this is all based on some research that I've conducted with Stuart Geiger and Lily Ronnie. And we have a research paper where you can learn more about some of these ideas, but and I made far too many slides for this presentation, but I do want to end with a couple just takeaways. So I've talked about scalar labor and how labor changes as projects scale. So what can communities do? One thing is to normalize discussions about workloads and burnout. And another thing is to check in with each other on a regular basis. Having fixed term or rotating positions can help governance deal with the problem of burnout. In addition to teams and leadership being open to scaling things back sometimes if they've overcommitted or underestimated how much labor something takes. Another thing to do is normalize taking breaks, taking time off. It's very common for people to overestimate how much energy we have, and people have different attitudes towards taking time off. So normalizing the practice of taking breaks or scaling back can be an important issue for governance and something that leaders can talk about. And the final thing I'll end with is that there's many ways to appreciate people. And part of having good labor practices is appreciating people through all sorts of other kinds of gestures of recognition. And I know that we're limited on time, so now we're going to transition a little bit. And thank you so much for hearing that out. And I will be sharing my slides and some additional readings. And now we are going to move to more of a small group facilitated discussion. So Dave, if you want to take back the torch, and we can facilitate this together.
Cool. Thanks, Dorothy. Let me also, so I have these slides about the breakouts, but you'll all see all of these prompts are in the shared notes doc. So I'll just go very quickly just to introduce the ideas. And in our development of this, we thought the breakout groups are the place where we can have conversation and reflection on these ideas. The prompts are not like survey questions or specific things you have to answer. It's just kind of weighs into the different categories we came up with or areas. But we thought folks would like to think about how these things relate to what you just saw, and also like put it in relation to your own work, perhaps with the foundation or perhaps in your own other practices. And we just hope that the breakouts are something, and all of this is something you can look back on, reflect on, find some use for moving ahead. So one group will be about the topic Dorothy just addressed about maintenance labor, thinking about the relationships of governance and labor, and people's experiences with that. More in tune with some of the questions and what Shauna introduced, thinking about if folks want to talk about shared values and how that informs the relationships we build and the culture of organizations, how those values might guide articulation of early stages of designing governance. If you've had experiences with that or trying to figure out, ways to navigate that, this might be where to go for talking about that. As relates to the project Dorothy and I are working on, we have a group about conflict resolution practice, but also about communication, which are deeply, as Ted Nelson would say, I guess, intertwinkled. Governance, is the basis for a lot of these practices, and how our approaches to designing governance inform conflict resolution and the overall health of our relationships is pretty vital. So we might talk about that there. And then finally, decision-making processes, some of which has also come up. There are different modes of making decisions and different contexts in which different modes of making decisions apply. Some are fast, some are slow, some involve a lot of people, some involve a benevolent dictator making quick choices. So if folks have grappled with that or have experiences with that or want to reflect on that, that can be the forum. And then, so that's just the overview. And then in that shared notes doc, which is in the chat, you can capture whatever comes up, and then maybe afterwards we'll share for a few minutes.
I can jump in then. Let's see. So we were talking about how a lot of projects that we encounter probably are like values driven and have shared values, but they're just not made explicit. And we're talking about how there are examples outside of the software community, like cooperatives that are very explicitly values driven and have like common touch points in like important meetings where they go over those shared values and spend time to update them as members change. And kind of trying to think of like what parallels are to the software world. And that could mean having some kind of training procedure where you have to like read through and maybe just like check boxes to see that you've at least seen the values. We're kind of leading by example and behavior by maintainers. So whenever discussing issues or pull requests, relating your opinions and points of view back to those values just to get more awareness on them. And I guess one example that we were looking at that is relatively close is Wikipedia, in that they do have very explicit values and they do have leading by example in the like senior editors. Anything else that you want to add? Cool.
Oh yeah, you mentioned the training, yeah. And then
Yeah,
some other, go ahead, on, please.
The thought I was trying to convey is just like we have the training in some community where people have the visibility into some of the value of the organization. So I think that the note that is perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, we were also, one interesting that popped up was like the challenge of knowing what those shared values are in an ongoing way. And so like people knowing why they're doing work on something together, informing the work, but also balancing that against the consideration Shauna offered, between like needing to do work, but also being inviting to newcomers or getting making sure things are clear. So that was really cool.
Ahmad, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Um, yeah, we were like talking about especially like who can afford to volunteer since like typically like open source like participation is voluntary, but also there's like different ways, like for example like a company can be paying an employee to contribute, and it might be easier for them to maintain contribution to a project rather than someone who is volunteering. And then also we're talking about the length of commitment and how in any software projects, especially open source projects, it's really important for there to be like long-standing people who have this like institutional knowledge about a specific project, and like the governance around it. Um, but also it can be kind of like a slippery slope where like maybe people join the project without that intention. And they have that like we talked about, like the what did they sign up for moment, and like kind of like be stuck in this like important role when like they might have like other commitments outside of that. So like, and like especially when they like leave, like what how do you deal with that? And like even though it's like it's on a volunteer basis, like it's more important to have like long, or as important to have like long-standing people in a project rather than just like a lot more contributors who might like go in and out to like maintain that knowledge. So we kind of talked about like how like something like a mentorship model could potentially be great to like pass the torch and kind of like distribute institutional knowledge from like older members and members who have been um, part of the project, to encourage to encourage like newer participants and newer volunteers, and kind of keep that rhythm going, and keep kind of like the spirit of the project going as people leave and enter.
Yeah, I would add also like about the distinction or the yeah how to handle the fact that some people in a project may be paid for their contributions and others may not, and how do you transparently address this and make sure that people feel like their labor is valued and that they're getting something out of their contributions. And yeah, this is an open question as part of the foundation. Personally, I've always have to think about this. How do we how yeah, fairness in the way that we relate to people when there's some programs that where people get paid and some other ways to engage where they don't.
Amazing, thanks. And also I like that Nahi added a question that was very like practical and specific about like how processing contributors can support each other or get support, which is a good point link to the resources on the Discord, and maybe also opportunities to explore more ways that projects like this can support people. Should we just go to the next one? Conflict resolution and communication.
Yeah, so we talked about some of our personal experiences we've had with like some healthy ways to resolve conflict and communicate what's going on. We talked about like having clear contribution guidelines to determine like have documentation about like what's accepted, not accepted, have emphasis on like how to be like a welcoming community in the documentation when doing contributions. Miayi talked about how at like her grad school they had town halls where whether or not there was conflict or not. And that was a space for people to come together and bring up anything that could happen, and voice any concerns. And then also like opportunities to set up like more private meetings that are open for people to come to and are invited to join and like say that they would like to join, but it's not like required for everybody to go to. Um, and then I also talked about having how wording when trying to resolve conflict is like really important, especially like for instance, if something went wrong, like to have a blameless like attitude towards it, so that like you can create a space where people aren't afraid to admit like when something is wrong, so that everybody can come together and try to resolve the issue, rather than try to like point fingers and see who was the one that caused that issue, because that doesn't actually help resolve the conflict.
Nice. Yeah, and I think I was glad this came up in both talks and in people's conversations. And as Dorothy pointed out, we'll have a lot more to share about this in the coming months from the work we're doing on our project. But this is great stuff as well. And then I guess we want to jump down to the final group talking about decision making.
We didn't assign one,
Ah,
but I can regurgitate a little bit. So we talked about kind of different things each of us did. And Rox, thank you again for notating. But what came up with talking about subcommittees as opposed to like large en masse like critical think, which of course is beautiful and has its place and is important. But depending upon the process or the need or the pacing, like being able to approach a different type of decision-making structure based on interest or capacity to vote with every person in a room to make a single decision. Consensus decision-making came up as like a frame and a method. And that also being something that is a bit of a like useful like slowdown too, like that requires people to not have the instant like gratification of the instantaneous decision to be made and for that goal to be reached ASAP, but for the thought process to be unfolded. And that's when like difference comes into play, and when negotiation or conversation or learning happens more broadly. And trust was something that came up as well. And I was talking a little bit about like when one enters a circle, like there might be an assumed trust, and then you could build from that, or you might have to build that to begin with. And yeah, like being able to partition out conversations, not to cordon them off, but to allow them to happen more intentionally between fewer people, and then come back to a larger group and report back, and then the larger group make a decision together from whatever is being brought to it. So yeah, these different scaffolded methods were things that were brought up, and Rupa shared, which if you don't mind, I'll share again in the chat, if that's okay, Rupa, but a poster about consensus decision making, and then an article that I'm excited to read called Solidarity, Reciprocity, Distribution, also related to our topic. Yeah, it was pretty generative. So thank you. Did I miss anything?
I'll just really quickly add that poster is hanging in my living room. So I'm looking at it right now. So yeah, I think it's a really cute kind of articulation about consensus decision-making processes and thinking about how to incorporate voices, but still having a structure and having kind of a logic and a process and a scaffolding, as Buffy was talking about. So I'll just leave that there.
Amazing. Cool. All right. Well, you all have the notes. And yeah, hopefully like these are not separate things really, right? These are all things that need to be integrated, I think, based on everything we saw today. So thanks for that. And I guess we have
Yeah, for this last 5 minutes, we just wanted to open it up to any thoughts that you have about governance based on the conversation today. And we're particularly interested in how you might apply some of these ideas to the open source communities that you're currently part of, and what kinds of what areas of this conversation have been interesting to you and what they've brought up. So we'll just open it up now.
Can I do a +1 to this? Could we use this as an opportunity to check out for folks to say their name one more time or for the first time today and their pronoun, and I'm gonna lovingly volunteer everyone to do this, everyone, so we can popcorn it. And we don't have it, we only do have like 5 minutes, so we can try to keep our little short shares, but just to get everyone's voice in the room. And to reflect on everything. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Raphael. I go by he, him, or they, them pronouns, and I'm the program coordinator for the PROS program and the processing community lead at the Processing Foundation. And I'll add that our next cohort meeting for PROS is on the 11th, and midpoint evaluations are coming, so you'll get some information about that early next week. And I'll popcorn it to Claudine.
Hi, Claudine. I use she, her pronouns, and yeah, I'm one of the pro grantees. And yeah, this whole session was amazing. I have more feels, like I like a lot of things that were mentioned, I just really relate to. And I learned a lot as well, because right now I'm in an art collective that's building now, and we're forming our governance processes. So just learning from my decision-making group was really helpful, and there's a lot to read to help this group. But even just all the other organizations I've been in and what my experience from that, and then hearing of the lessons learned, just the general themes, has been really great. So thank you. I will pass it on to Ahmad.
Hi, I'm Ahmad. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Processing Foundation fellow. And after today's session, I've just been thinking about how like unique that like governance can be in like open source projects where like often people are like volunteering their time for just because that they are like oftentimes like they are like passionate about a specific project, and just like a unique kind of governance that differs from like the governance like actual like governments, like local or state governments, or like the structure of something that it would be more corporate. And there's just like so much to think about in this like purely volunteer like governance structure. And yeah, just like so much that can go right and so much that can go wrong. And just like in terms of thinking about how like an open source project is like ultimately it's a community and it's a set of relationships uh that have people behind it at first, and it's like important to treat um projects and governments like that, just like it is ultimately people, and you have to be respectful about that. And you also have to check in that like you're treating people like people rather than like treating the needs of the project, but like also just like important to like fight against factors like burnout or just like people like leaving certain projects after having a bad experience. But yeah, so much to think about. I'll popcorn to Dora.
Hi, I'm Dora. I'm one of the pro grantees. My pronouns are she, her. And the thing that really resonated with me the most was like the aspects of like what makes a good culture and good relationships. I think like that perfectly articulated my thoughts about like how to describe the kind of community that I want to be involved with in. So I definitely gonna share that out to everybody that I know. I'll popcorn to Dia.
Hi everyone, I'm Dia. I go by she and her. What I took out most out of today's conversation is inclusivity and fostering strong relationships, be it mentor-mentee or between collaborators, and how all of it is more about collaboration and not contribution, all in those senses of having a stronger culture in the community in terms of inclusivity. Thanks. I popcorn it to Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave. I go by he, him, and I'm one of the pros mentors. And I think it was always sort of important to me when maintaining P5 to make sure that anyone who wants to ramp up on it has the ability to do so. But I think it's been made clear today that in order to keep a project healthy and like avoid burnout for everybody involved, there has to be like a cycle of changing leadership. And so it's just like ever more important to keep that influx of new people and have there be a path to ramp up. I will popcorn to Miyagi.
Hi, I'm Miao. I use they them pronouns. I'm one of the pros grantees. I think Dorothy's presentation today was very interesting to me, and I learned a lot. And I think I also started to examine how I think of open source projects from like 2 years of experience, because I came from a traditional corporate tech background, and to me, that's where I experienced a lot of burnout. And then when I switched to, like contributing to the processing foundation, I felt like even though I understood that open source projects come with their unique challenges, I'm still like, oh, like this is where, where things are happening. And I think I'm almost idealizing our work a little bit. So I will definitely, like revisit the slides later and sit with it a little more and hopefully come to like a more balanced perspective later. Yeah. Oh, and I'll popcorn to Buffy.
Hi, Buffy, she, her pronoun. Um, I'm thinking with a lot, like through today's conversation. Thank you all for your insight, as well, because I think like these are like we're having these like conversations on like guidelines or structures, but they're raw. This is what I'm thinking about and taking away, I suppose, too. Like these are raw from deeply personal experiences, deeply personal like emotions, feelings, like difficult things that like emotions don't have to be difficult, but under capitalism they are. So I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which like our choices, decisions, methods are also these deeply emotive and affective materials, things that exist between us, which is I really appreciate how Shauna was focusing on relationships post process, and then being able to frame process through the frame of or through the rubric of relation and relationship, and that being an ongoing unfolding of correspondence between like bodies and minds. Yeah. Who wants to go next? Let's go with Rupa. Did you go?
I did not. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rupa. I use she, her pronouns. I am a Processing Foundation Fellow. I apologize that my camera's not on. I have not been feeling at 100% today, and I am looking very messy right now. So I think the biggest thing I really appreciated what Miaoye just said about not idealizing things. And I think the biggest takeaway, it was just a validation of something that I've been thinking about throughout my whole project, which is this idea that we just can't assume things. And I think we just really, particularly in these communities, we just want to assume that everybody's on the same page. We want to assume that everybody agrees with us. We want to assume that our values are the ones that everybody holds in the same amounts as Shauna was talking about. But I think today was a reminder that just these things need to be articulated and communicated, not just once, but routinely over and over and over again. And this is the only way that we're actually going to build spaces where people feel like they have their voices heard and people feel like they are actually contributing to a project in more ways than one and can have their labor and their time and their efforts appreciated. And I don't know, a lot of parallels in the art community too, where I just feel like a lot of the times we just expect things to kind of run on vibes. And today was also a reminder that there needs to be structure, there needs to be kind of processes in place. Again, a clear articulation of these things that need to be set up so that when conflict emerges or when things are not aligned or when people have differing ideas about what the goals of a community is, you're able to kind of point back to kind of the previous work that's been done that has been articulated in an explicit way and kind of use that to guide the way that you chat through some of that stuff. Okay, I will pass to Rox.
Hey everyone, I'm Roxanne, she, her pronouns. I'm a Processing Foundation fellow. And my takeaway for today was like, again, a further appreciation of being a part of this community and getting to not only be a contributor, but an active part in the open source community. And then just like in my own individual collective experience with art collectives and art, or specifically art tech collectives, I'll be taking away. It's been a continuous thing of like, yeah, not just running on vibes, or at least reclaiming the word vibes. You know, vibes doesn't have to be no governance at all. You know, and trying to, and it's nice to just be in this town hall where everyone's like caring about this stuff and continuing to work on it. So feeling energized, feeling good. I can popcorn it to Dorothy.
Thanks. And I'm Dorothy, she, her, and a fellow here. And I also really liked the notion in the chat, meow of the not idealizing things. And I know reflecting on open source, it's a very idealistic place, and people even use the language of evangelizing, like it's a church or something like that, like it's a religion. And at times it's felt that important to me, that because I really do believe in it, but that idealizing things can also be a way of kind of losing track of the issues that we need to address. And so I really liked that, and thank you all so much. And who hasn't spoken yet? On?
Yeah, hi, my name is Anh, and I use the gym for now, and I'm a protecting fellow of this year. What I take away from this discussion is, I really love all the talk, and they teach me a lot. And thank you, Dorothy and David, for organizing such a great discussion. I especially appreciate the love and care aspect of open source community. Allow me to idealizing it a little bit different, but I appreciate the slide on the love languages of open source community of Dorothy. I think that I can incorporate some of the ideas to my own community. And also I'm thinking about the cultural divergent aspect impact of this, because I come from a culture where transparency and open governance is not the norm. So I'm thinking a lot about that. Yeah, thank you so much for this. I love being here. Yeah. Who hadn't go? Oh, may I popcorn to Luis?
Thanks, Anne. So I am Luis. I go by he, him pronouns. I am a processing foundation fellow as well. I realized that like governance can inform the way we do everything inside the project, and it's something that is directly related to our mental health. It has emotional impacts about how we feel in relation to our own work and about our relationships with other members who work with us. So I think it's really a key aspect for me regarding projects sustainability and especially in open source projects as we have seen today. So I appreciate so much how these conversations help us to address real issues in our projects and in our day-to-day lives, I think. So thank you so much for the opportunity to learn with you all these important concepts. Yeah, I'll popcorn to David.
Thanks. I'll try to be quick. I'm David. He, him. I'm one of the processing fellows working with Dorothy on a project together. A big takeaway for me was a really like sense of gratification or like happiness that everyone has such like direct and personal relationships with these ideas, and it seems like everyone has encountered some facet of these considerations in their work or in their communities, and I'm really happy to hear that the things that were presented today were relevant to what people are working on, and hopefully we were able to. It's such a huge topic, so we knew we could only poke at certain things. And that idea of shared things is one of the big takeaways I had, that like reaffirming like the shared values or shared goals or shared meaning and purpose, like the sharing of labor, all these things are really good reminders of what to keep in mind and work on. I think Nat joined us late, but you should get an intro, Nat.
Good morning, everyone. Nat, they, them pronouns. I am so lucky to be a mentor to David and Dorothy, and I'm a processing fellowship alumni. And I'm so grateful for a Zoom recording feature that I get to watch this. I've been having a lot of sleep issues, so it didn't happen for me this morning, unfortunately, but I'm so happy. I know that this presentation was amazing. I can't wait to go back and absorb that. And I think this conversation and the interest in the work happening in this space gives me a lot of hope, thinking about, it's not just what we're doing and what we're producing, it's also how we're doing that and how that impacts all the people at every level. So yeah, feeling like awake around this topic and like a lot of hope, but I'll have, I think, a lot more to reflect on after I watch the presentation. But glad I could catch the end. Has anyone not gone? Sige, do you wanna
Hello. Yes, I will go, and I will go in closing us out because we are 15 minutes over time. Um, but I really and also what a way to start your morning, Nat. What a way to I don't know where this is for everyone's day, but what a day. Um, thank you all so much. My big takeaway is just gratitude. Gratitude for everyone's participation, gratitude to our speakers, gratitude to our fellows who holding it down. Incredible. Thank you all so much. I'm not going to say anything else. That's it, because you deserve your time back as well. But also, we could just hang out the rest of the day on Zoom. What do you guys got going on? You want to? No? Okay. Yes, hearts all around. I can't wait for our last two town hall sessions. They're going to be great. If you need a revision on those topics, they're in the email, but there'll be more info to come. Thank you all so much, and can't wait to see you all again and chat more. Yeah, we should. David, do you just want to hang out on Zoom? Everyone else can leave. We'll just chat. Anyone else who wants to stay?
And thanks,
Robin.
Sige. Thanks for hosting, Sige. Wonderful job on that.
Happy to.
You're all amazing.
Bye.
Thank you.
See
Thank
you then.
you.